Thank you, everyone, for joining us for the webinar from SOQ to IDIQ, Trail Contracting Models. My name is Candace Gallagher, and I am the Director of Operations and Webinar Coordinator for American Trails. This is our 136th webinar in the American Trails Advancing Trails webinar series. And I am very excited to be partnering with the Professional Trail Builders Association to offer 3 webinars the first Thursday over the next 3 months, so October, November, and December. These webinars are free thanks to PTBA as well as Federal Highway Administration. This webinar is being recorded. It offers learning credits and includes real-time closed captioning in English, and a link will follow along in the chat box if you don't already see it there. And attendees will receive a closed caption transcript and a link to the recording in my follow-up email. And we are saving time for attendee questions at the end of the webinar, and we welcome you to send your questions at any time during today's presentation via the questions box. And don't hesitate to ask any questions you might have for our staff as well in regards to our webinar series. And I am excited to introduce our webinar presenters. We have Erin Kay, Executive Director of the Professional Trail Builders Association. We have Jeremy Wimpey, Principal of Applied Trails Research. Scott Linnenburger, Principal with K-Lin Enterprises. Jed Talbot, owner of OBP Trailworks, as well as Scott Gordon, Managing Consultant with Contour Logic. So I will now hand controls off to Erin to get started.
Hi, my name is Erin Kay, and thank you for joining us, as Candace said, for the first of 3 PTBA webinars. Just briefly about PTBA, we are the trade association for the trail building industry, and we represent the world's only private sector of professional trail contractors and consultants. Our members are professionally vetted through a robust portfolio submission process and peer review. We have 115 member companies worldwide, and as you can see, most are currently in North America. And concurrently, our trail projects span the globe in 2020. PTBA member companies represent the diversity in the trail building world with professional skill sets in trail construction, including hand and mechanized, construction management, trail design, field layout and flagging, trail master planning, bridges and boardwalks, rock work and rigging, technical trainings and education, trail restoration and reclamation, and specialty trail features. So today we're going to be talking about contracts for trails. So this will include bidding models, feasibility, planning, design, and assessment, construction, including small, large, and design build projects, and then hybrid contracts with youth corps, volunteer, and staff assistance. And as we're talking through and going through the presentation, we're really looking forward to see what questions you have in the chat so that we can save 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the time to make sure we answer as many as we can. So I'm going to be handing it off to our 4 PTBA member company representatives, including Jeremy Wimpey of Applied Trails Research, Scott Linnenburger of K-Lin Enterprises, Jed Talbot, who is with OBP Trailworks, and he's also PTBA's board president, and Scott Gordon, who is with Contour Logic. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Candace. We're excited to be here. I'm going to start kind of down in the paperwork space here before we hand it off to the 2 Scotts and Jed. And just to have a foundation as we think about trail contracting and solicitation tools. Notice, these are the mechanisms that we use for solicitation, bidding, and award of trail construction or trail maintenance and construction and planning projects. And we want to note, we're only going to talk about 3 different types, or primarily talk about 3 different types of bidding mechanisms or bidding tools, the RFQ, the RFP, and the IDIQ here today. But recognize that there is a broader space, but this is kind of the core foundation in that space. And selecting from these 3 types of tools and then additional details related to these contracting mechanisms and solicitation mechanism, tying those to your project's scope of work, your available resources, both on the client and on the vendor or the contractor side of the agreement. And also marrying those to timelines for your deliverables. And next slide. And we'll start with the RFQ. Primarily, when we're talking about RFQ as a contracting mechanism, we're going to be talking about requests for quotations. This is going to be one of our more simple types of solicitation for work to be done, and it's often used with smaller projects or projects where we have very tightly defined units. Think of a project replacing a trail bridge that got taken out in a flood, and the associated trail tread that connects the existing trail to that bridge. We have a very tight definition of what that bridge is, a 20-foot bridge to be replaced. We've got a relatively short timeline. We want to get that thing opened back up so that our recreationists can start enjoying it. And recognizing that we might not need a whole lot of, the planning work is probably already done at that point, but we might not need as many resources on both sides of the contract to accomplish that relatively short-term project. A request for quote is often awarded to the lowest qualified bid or the lowest complete bid that was submitted, and evaluating different types or approaches to the work is usually not needed in the request for quotation type of arrangement. There is a second RFQ that gets used quite a bit, and I'll define that here just so that we can be explicit and not have confusion there, but request for qualifications is another RFQ, another same acronym, but this is often part of a larger contract solicitation or other contracting vendor relationship where we're looking to get a feel for the competency, expertise, quality, and qualifications of a vendor. And these are typically used as part of an RFP process or IDIQ or BPA process, or some other, a lot of federal folks on the lines are probably familiar with RFQs from different phases of federal procurement. If we transition to the next slide and RFPs, we're moving towards a more complex model of solicitation, a request for proposal. And here in the RFP space, we still need to have a good sense of what our scope of work or statement of work that needs to be accomplished are. We need to have a solid vision or plan in place that defines our goals clearly. But we may not have as strict of or as straight of a path to go along from project start to project finish. There may be multiple different ways that a project could be approached. You're working in a diverse space with natural surface trails, and contractors will bring their different resources, skills, and tools to bear in that space. So in the RFP process, we're looking for vendors to propose an approach, and as part of that, they'll be demonstrating their qualifications and competency, but also demonstrating to the vendor that they have a clear understanding of the goals and vision of the project, and that they are proposing a set of timelines and resources and knowledge and skills and competencies that will get the project accomplished, recognizing that you may have 10 different proposals come in on a project like for an RFP for a complex trail project, and likely none of those are going to be exact cookie cutter copies of each other due to the nature of the resources that teams put together to accomplish these things. A little bit more resources needed on the client side to effectively implement a request for proposal. You need to be able to evaluate what's been proposed against the project's vision and goals. Often that, as you'll hear from others today, involves having a previous phase of the work, whether it's design or planning that was done in-house or externally through some sort of contracting mechanism. Having that knowledge and expertise available during the review of these proposals to ensure that you're selecting a competent and a good fit for your project. Whereas the RFQ is often awarded to the lowest cost or the lowest qualified bid, RFPs can be ranked and evaluated across multiple criteria, helping the client and the contractor match and mesh the resources to accomplish the goals of the project. And then finally, we're going to talk about IDIQs and BPAs. These are probably familiar to some of the federal folks on the line. The southeastern region of the U.S. Forest Service, Region 8, has an IDIQ in the trail space that's rather broad, that encompasses everything from trail inventory and assessment work that we're going to hear from Scott Linnenburger about next, to planning and design and construction and maintenance. So a pretty broad umbrella of trail-related topics on the southeastern region's IDIQ or BPA for that type of work. And what they do under these indefinite deliverable, indefinite quantities or blanket purchase agreement space really opens up the ability to work in that broad space, however broad you define it, but work with multiple vendors to accomplish specific task orders or projects. And so there's a qualification project process at the front end of these, where the agency or the client will put out an IDIQ solicitation asking folks to qualify to work in that space. Folks will respond similar to an RFP with a proposal and a team and their statement of qualifications to work in the space. And then different from an RFP that's always targeted or usually targeted at a specific single project or phase of a project, the IDIQ is for multiple years, and it allows these agencies to then retain the services of a pool of qualified vendors, and they can issue task orders or purchase orders in that space for specific projects along the way. Two last notes before we transition to Scott Linnenburger is just that when you're working in an IDIQ or BPA, there are often minimums out on an annual minimum for anyone that's qualified under a blanket purchase agreement, for example. It's kind of like a retainer where any entity of qualified, if you do have that clause, you want to award that much work per year, or else the clause in there requires you to make some kind of a payment in lieu of a project going out. And then also note that under any of these, the RFQ, the RFP, or an IDIQ where you're then issuing task orders against it, the schedule of items that you're being paid for can vary from lump sum, time and materials type arrangements, or pay items and billable for actual as constructed units on the ground. So there's some flexibility across each of those. And again, going from the RFQ down to the IDIQ, we're moving from a more simple structure to a more complex structure, and pairing that with your project's goals and timelines and your available resources is really important as you think about successful trail contracting.
So as many of you know, it's not as easy as saying we want to build a trail. There's some questions to be answered before you can get to the point where you are doing trail construction. And in the contracting world, matching those questions that need to be answered with the kind of deliverable or product that you need to have to get you to that next step is an important part of the process. If we start at the most basic, when we're looking at trail feasibility, can a trail be constructed in this area or through some set of situations? Developing a feasibility study will provide you at the end with a deliverable of a conceptual plan. A conceptual plan probably isn't a foot-by-foot delineation of where the trail would go, but more of a high-level product that answers that first question of, can we get a trail in here? And if we want to, what would the general costs involved be? As we move closer towards developing that trail, we know a trail can be developed in an area. We're starting to ask a question of what kind of trail or trail system do we want, and how can it be developed and at what cost? And the we in this situation is not only a contracting entity or land management agency, but the public and stakeholders at large. We want to know how much that trail is going to cost, what it's going to look like at the end, and how it can be fashioned to meet the needs of the trail users that we expect to have on it. That kind of planning, a trail plan or a trail master plan, is oftentimes ground truthed, but not always delineating the exact location of the trail or any structures that would be included in that trail construction. So when we're getting closer to the point of constructing a trail, we're going to need a formal design. And some agencies and entities have great abilities to do this on their own and put together those kind of design plans. In other cases, it's not something that an entity undertakes quite a bit, and bringing in a professional to provide that professionally vetted design of where the trail exactly would go on the ground, what types of features would be involved, and getting then to a much closer kind of developable cost is now getting us to the place where we are in a position to either seek funding or if we have funding to develop a trail. And when we're going through a design process, the deliverable that's going to come out the back end of that should be a trail design with specifications and construction processes, mapping elements. So we're looking at that point a construction documentation, a set of construction documents about how the trail will be built, and where the features will go, and the process of minimizing erosion and sedimentation during that process. Oftentimes, we see situations where entities have a bunch of trails on the ground, and the question that they have is, what do we do with these? We've got sustainability issues, or natural resource issues, or wildlife issues. How do we resolve what these issues are? When you're going through a trail assessment and inventory process like that, to answer those questions, what you need to be developing is a maintenance or a redevelopment plan that would, very much like a design plan and construction documents, provide specifications as to what activities need to happen where, and what the lengths of those activities are. So when you get to the point where you're contracting, you can put out a contract request, an RFQ, or an RFP that can give you competitive and qualified kind of bids on that project. So in any of these kind of more soft trail products, plans of sorts, when you're looking for a contractor and sending out a request, an RFP, or you're asking for a request for qualifications and going to be receiving a statement of qualifications, the elements there on the right are pretty much across the board a good general level of items that you need to be putting forth to explain the project appropriately and get qualified bids for that. So what is the utility of these types of products? First, when you seek to use a professional, you get a professionally vetted deliverable that that entity is responsible for. They have placed their reputation out there in service of your project, and knowing that these kind of folks, like the panelists we have here, are working on trails every day of the year, and in many different kinds of circumstances and many different trail types, should give you the confidence that you're starting down the pathway in the right way. Second, these kind of products then provide your entity, both guidance in how to take the next step towards developing the trail. And we all know that trails aren't instantly funded and can sometimes have plans that wait a while for the trail construction to happen. And having that plan there provides that institutional memory that can be retained when there are other assets to be able to move forward to construction. These kind of documents also assist in fundraising, because rather than being able to just say, we want to build a trail or we want to build a trail system, you can better explain to constituents and potential funders, grant-making entities, what exactly is going to be developed and how it would be utilized by the community. And finally, most in the case of construction documentation for either a maintenance or a construction project, these kind of documents help realize quality control in the process. They give the client and the contractor a common document that both can look at during the course of a project and come to an agreement as to, are we doing this the right way and most efficient way, or have we strayed from that in some way? And finally, some frequently asked questions that we have about these types of projects and products and deliverables in the natural surface trail world is, do we need to have these kind of documents stamped by a professional engineer or landscape architect? And in the natural surface trail world, it's not likely, unless there's engineered structures present, such as large bridges or areas of pavement or other brick and mortar type of facilities. Sometimes there are contracting entities or funding sources that require this to be stamped. I would caution folks in this regard. It's challenging sometimes to find a professional engineer that would stamp a trail design because it's not something that is really a stampable element. When should you do these kinds of projects? Well, especially for field design or inventory and assessment kind of work, those projects are really best done, most efficiently accomplished, and cost effectively when there isn't greenery around and when water tables are high. We'd like to be able to see as much of the forest and the cause for trail problems as possible, and the water influence in the landscape as much as possible when doing that kind of design and assessment work. If you're looking to find a professional to help get you started down this path of developing a trail, how long do you need to give that process? And right now in the world of PTBA contractors and consultants, most folks are scheduling out projects 6 months to a year in advance. So putting in your request for proposals that will receive proposals on May 1st, and we want folks to get started on May 15th, that may deter folks from putting together a proposal for you. Thinking about this process in terms of months to years is a much better way to start in getting quality assistance. And our project teams a positive or a negative attribute in realizing a good product. And while that always depends, it's good to understand that many companies specializing in natural surface trails are quite small and specialized, and to undertake larger projects, oftentimes form teams to bring more resources to bear to get the project done more efficiently, or to cover all the bases of the skill levels and skill sets needed to get a great project done.
Great, thanks, Scott. So construction contracts. Trail construction contracts often reflect the complexity of the project and or the parties involved with the project. For instance, a simple time and materials contract for professional crew to conduct maintenance on a backcountry trail on federal Forest Service lands, for instance, or for a partnering trail club may only be a few pages long, anywhere from 3 or 4 to 10 to 15 perhaps. But on the other side of the spectrum, it's not out of the ordinary for a project that involves multiple parties such as landowner or landowners, municipalities, civil engineering firms, landscape architects, trail design companies, and trail building companies together to have a much more extensive contract. Some of these can approach or exceed 100 pages in length and have a significant amount of legalese and boilerplate templates that have been sort of cut and pasted from more traditional engineering projects. So we're going to go over some of that stuff in a little bit of detail, but the slide that you see on your screen right now encompasses most of the clauses and terms that are addressed in typical trail construction contracts. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into detail about each one of these elements or even read the list. It's primarily included as a resource for folks to be able to look back on. The actual content of trail project contracts is at least a full webinar in and of itself, if not, a day-long workshop. So we can advance, there we go, to small construction projects. So what is a small versus a large construction project? Well, with most things trail related, there's no one definition or standard. For instance, in the state of Maine, where I'm from, if I'm working for the state, the threshold for a small construction project is $50,000 or less. If you're working within the GSA, the General Services Administration, on the federal level, like for the Forest Service, for instance, anything under $10,000 will likely be considered a micro purchase threshold, and then anything up to $250,000 may be considered a simple acquisition. anything over $250,000, and it gets more complicated along every step of the process. But still, $250,000 may be, or a $200,000 project may be considered pretty darn large to a lot of the clients that we service. Considering I do a lot of work with land trusts and smaller organizations as well. So, small construction projects. One of the things that sets them apart, aside from the actual numbers, they generally have a more clearly defined scope of work, or SOW, as Jeremy was saying, such as like a single bridge or staircase. It could be a modest bike skills park, or a maintenance contract for a trail or a particular set of backcountry hiking trails. There sometimes is a design element that's been brought in by, that's been proposed by another design firm, and sometimes it's not. It could be set up as a lump sum contract, which is basically a not to exceed price, or the contractor says they will get the work done for a particular cost. A time and materials contract, which is basically saying this is the cost of our labor, cost of our materials, and cost of any equipment, and then you invoice accordingly. Or it could be something like a cost plus or a line item form, which are not used as much, but that's basically cost plus is reimbursing, where the contractor reimburses the client for expenses plus profit. And then line item contracts are basically broken down. Every single thing has a line item cost, such as excavated trail per lineal foot, bridge cost per lineal foot, culverts, et cetera, et cetera. Due to the defined scope and relatively low budget for contracts for small projects, they're usually in that 10 to 15 page range, sometimes only a couple pages long, like I mentioned. They don't necessarily need to include all of the clauses that was shown in my last slide, but they do need to cover the basics, such as defining the parties involved, the scope of work, the payment schedule, insurance requirements, work warranties, and dispute resolution is a pretty critical one to include in there as well. Moving on to the larger projects. I was in a PTBA board meeting earlier this week, and one of our long-time, fairly charismatic individuals, Charlie Dundas, was talking about one of his projects. And he said, the bigger the project, the bigger the challenge. And it seemed pretty appropriate and relevant to our discussions here. Although the contractual fundamentals and the foundation of our contracts remain similar for large and small contracts, there are generally a lot more variables with large projects that need to be taken into account. They include use of subcontractors, bonding requirements, coordination of multiple parties, more close adherence to design documents and potentially engineered drawings with a PE stamp on it, physical engineer stamp on it. Change orders are also very common on large projects. So one of the keys to success with large projects is anticipating that and the need to address unexpected changes that you're going to find in the field before you get to the field. And I've found one of the best ways to keep those projects running smoothly is by retaining the design team that's been involved on some level, at least throughout the construction project. So a lot of projects seek to get a design and they, bid adieu to the design team and they bring in a construction team. And when that construction team, when the design team is, retains some sort of involvement, it really just helps things move a lot more smoothly, because it's generally the designers and the builders that are best equipped to explain, the nuances of trail construction and the reasons behind the need for particular ground truth changes once the excavation and the dirt starts moving. And so when those folks can work together as a team, the project is generally able to be a little more dynamic and nimble, while staying budget conscious, and there's generally more robust conversations with all stakeholders involved. So moving on to design build projects, they're a little bit of a different beast. There may or may not, but generally there is not a comprehensive design plan with a design build project, so the builder can act both as the designer and the trail constructor. So a lot of trail contractors prefer this model for the construction phase because it allows some flexibility to tweak the final alignment and the construction techniques in the field based on, unanticipated variables. We're working on a project now where we've hit a tremendous amount of sloping ledge that we didn't know we were going to hit with our excavation, and water's following that ledge. That means we have to do things differently than what was laid out in some of our design documents. So how do we address that? We're also building in a very wet time right now here in Maine, following a very dry year where a lot of design work was done. So we're uncovering a lot of hidden seeps and water issues where they were not anticipated. So design build projects allow you to work through some of those issues with perhaps sort of thoughtful approaches to the construction process that it may not necessarily be laid out in a design document. So in terms of cost, design build projects are a little bit more nebulous. On the one hand, there are usually less design costs up front because it hasn't been contracted out separately to a design team. Additionally, a lot of the trail construction contractors that I know feel like they can provide the most cost-efficient and aesthetically pleasing solution when they're given a sort of more open canvas. But on the other hand, there's sometimes concern, and sometimes valid concern, that the builder will perhaps embellish the need for a complex or costly solution if given, that same open canvas. So in my opinion, this is largely alleviated in a few ways. Number one, and this goes for all of the previously mentioned contracts as well, selecting a bidder through a robust process that heavily weights experience and past performance with relevant projects. I know both Jeremy and Scott touched on that a little bit as well. If you can determine and define potential line item costs before the construction begins, so even if you're working under, say, a lump sum contract, figure out what those extra items that might come into play later would cost, even if they weren't included in the original bid package, so that they're there in black and white if you come into that circumstance where you might need to add something. And lastly, really investing in the relationship between the client and the contractor with frequent meetings and forthright conversations. Trying to come to decisions together as opposed to having like a builder push for particular, changing construction needs, really helps everybody kind of come together and realize why the construction methods are what they are in any given environment. So to recap, the keys that I see, you can go to the next slide, please. The keys to success for construction-based projects is first and foremost, sort of developing that trust and sense of responsibility with all the stakeholders on the project. So I was just mentioning this, but an investment of time and energy in the relationship really generally pays dividends for everyone. Each member of the team should be elevated to their respective roles in the project. Their voice should be heard, and coming to decisions together really does help any of these projects move forward. As I mentioned, also identifying those line items in advance really helps make those potentially awkward conversations about changes to the original plan run more smoothly. And also, everybody should demand a solid justification for any change that would be happening. And also engaging the design team during the construction project. As I said, the better the relationship is with the design team, the better the project will likely end up being. And then Be covered legally. Obviously, we talked a little bit about the contract end. The contract is there when things go awry, right? And to lay out the basic principles of how the relationship is going to work financially. In that sense, it's very important. But when the relationship between all the projects and a partner is solid, the contract verbiage rarely comes into discussion, much less contention. So if you keep your sights on your end goal and everyone's rewarded, with a high standard trail that's, particularly tailored to the environment, generally at a reasonable and transparent cost, and it bodes well for everybody involved.
Awesome, bunch of great information from Jeremy and Scott and Jed, and most of that's really focused on working with private sector, consultants and contracting firms. However, as we see the funding climate evolve, funding mechanisms evolve, and our publics and stakeholders becoming more and more involved, we do see quite a lot of other forms of other labor resources and other forms of maintenance and construction. When we're working with a single NGO or stewardship group, many of the same principles, even documents, can apply to contract work to that NGO as if they were a for-profit contractor. However, when we have multiple labor resources coming together on a project, we tend to refer to that as a hybrid project or hybrid construction. The challenge, of course, there is how do we coordinate a bunch of different folks to make sure we're getting the continuity of product and really relaying the vision and all the nuance to a number of different folks versus a single source. In terms of labor resources, I'm not going to go through everything on this list. They do vary quite a bit, from professionals to semi-professionals to rank novices and amateurs. Professional contractors, owner-operators, agency staff, definitely professionals. I have noticed that agency staff definitely, some of those folks have been mentors of mine and are amazing trail planners and designers and builders. Others are really kind of getting their feet wet. So that can have a lot of variation in terms of experience and production. The volunteers are actually another group that's a whole heck of a lot like that too. We sometimes tend to think of volunteers as like the large 40 or 200 person volunteer day, avid trail users, hikers, mountain bikers, whomever. Sometimes it's corporate folks as well, just kind of doing some community service. However, there are small groups of volunteers that are actually very highly skilled and can put down a product that is competitive or as good of a product as professional contractors, and sometimes it's just fast. Conservation corps and youth corps, AmeriCorps programs, we're seeing a lot of work with those folks, at least in the West, in California and Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and another labor source that sees quite a bit of variation, but almost without fail, there's an amount of production that can be counted on with those folks. Aaron, would you mind hitting the next slide? And I think the biggest benefits here of involving some of these other sources of trail construction labor are not necessarily cost savings, but the value adds. And sometimes that's having a labor resource available. For instance, in wilderness projects, that doesn't allow any mechanized construction, not excavators, not chainsaws, heck, not even wheelbarrows or an electric drill. And we're finding that many of the for-profit professional trail building companies, their skill set and their efficiency really comes from having a specialized equipment, knowing how to use it, and a workflow developed around it. Oftentimes, some of the conservation corps, the volunteers provide some really good hand labor on this wilderness project. Routine maintenance, if it's easy to lead a group, often can be done with more efficiently with conservation corps, volunteers, that sorts of thing. Particularly in those kind of many hands make light work situations, lots of just corridor pruning, de-duffing, things like that. I think the two other really kind of big benefits here are a way to engage our trail using publics, and sometimes that's to breed stewardship and appreciation and kind of some of the messaging around that. But sometimes it's also to get out in front of opposition or contention. The photo here is actually a reconstruction of a very difficult mountain bike trail that's well loved because of its challenge. Unfortunately, its challenge came from it eroding and quickly deteriorating. So the goal here was to put it back together in a way that was still challenging, still technical, but much more durable. And we could have absolutely brought in professionals, knocked this thing out in probably a week, but we chose to use primarily volunteers led by some professionals so that they had skin in the game and were actively involved, know what work went into it, and could help to defend the changes in the projects to their peers, as opposed to sitting on the other side of the fence and picking at. I think the other big one I want to hit on is funding, often involving volunteer groups or NGOs, taps into their funding sources as well. Meanwhile, many grant programs, Colorado's Trails program, absolutely puts a lot of weight on using youth or conservation corps. So sometimes it's a mechanism to help unlock some of that match funding that's required to move the project forward. I will say, in terms of cost savings and projects being cheaper with volunteers or youth corps or prison crews or whomever, generally speaking, when I've done the math, we find that the cost per foot is actually higher, particularly when we bring in the soft cost, the leadership cost, the preparation. So the cost savings that's kind of, we're learning, is more of a misnomer and doesn't always play through. Aaron, next slide, please. And our key challenges with some of these other labor sources really have to do with a lot of variety in their skill set and tooling, quite a bit of soft cost in terms of running their program, preparation and communication, and especially with the extra coordination that's required to make sure the project has that continuity, both from one piece of the project to the next, but also continuity from the plan, the design intent, down to the implemented project. Many of the youth corps type programs, even some of the prison corps type programs, will charge a fee per week, and as opposed to a fee per thing accomplished. And so that can become challenging too. If the project budget is fairly fixed, we know what we're going to pay, but we don't yet know how much work we're actually going to get done. And unfortunately, don't have a ton of control over it, which is a bit of a challenge. The other big challenge, it's kind of often forgotten about, but it can actually strain the relationship with contractors. Some contractors really don't like to have these other labor sources come in part because they lose a little bit of control of the production and the pace and even the finished product, even though they might be responsible for it. Others see it as competition, but if we match the project to the labor resources well and make sure they're actually going to help support contractors, it can actually benefit that relationship. So how do we do this? Aaron, next slide. There's a few different models. The three, I kind of lump it into three chunks. One is if we have a trail system, or even our scope can be divided up segment by segment and assigning each of those segments in whole to a given resource. The contractor might build segment A. This volunteer group might build segment B. This other stewardship organization might do the closure and restoration of an old route. Each group can have its own contract and be wholly responsible for its portion. Another approach is more of a task-wise option, where we might assign different steps in the process to different labor resources. For example, in wilderness, where there's no chainsaws, right, and we have a lot of corridor clearing to do, maybe there's a lot of blowdown from beetle kill in the west, we may actually want to use something like a Conservation Corps crosscut crew that has several crosscut saws, has training, has certification to go in and do that corridor clearing. Meanwhile, another crew or volunteer group might come in and do the trail construction. On other projects, We might have a professional trail contractor with specialized excavators and equipment do the heavy lifting, the rough work, the rough cut, and use volunteers or youth corps to come in and do the rake down, the hand finish, naturalizing, things like that. The third approach, and this will take a few different forms, is to still have a single contractor, usually a specialized trail contractor that's working as GC, and specify in the RFP right up front that they need to use a given labor resource, whether they have to hire and pay for that, or as a client, we're going to provide that and expect the contractor to use it. The benefit of that approach is we still have a single point of responsibility for delivering the final product. The downside is contractors are going to have to, I don't want to say pad their numbers, but make sure that they bid accordingly so that they can pick up the slack of how much construction or quality of construction is done by a non-labor resource that they don't have a ton of control over. Now, those are kind of the three models. I use that as a structure. Almost every project we do, it's some combination of those, or there's some other little benefit. We really want to tune our approach to the project's needs and the available labor resources. So let's hit a couple of quick tips on that, Aaron. I think the main key with hybrid construction and the main challenge is really that continuity. And to achieve that continuity, both in production and in finished product, it means that we need to do a little more, the project management has a larger role and a larger influence. So that means really having somebody, even whether it's the general contractor or if it might be the designer running a CM role, to help plan the project, sequence it, understand where the dependencies are, understand what kinds of work need to be done, what are the labor resources, and pair the task or segment with the skill set and availability of that resource. Going back and looking at the budget once numbers are in and say, hey, are we still going to be on track once we account for the soft costs, once we account for the extra design, the extra planning, that sort of thing. And making sure that we have enough design work done for each of those segments so that it's done at a level appropriate for the labor resource to follow. I'll talk about that again in a second. And that we provide enough direct leadership, particularly for those, I'll call them the semi-pro and amateur labor resources. So the conservation corps of volunteers, we've found working with several conservation corps in Colorado that we might be paying the crew roughly $7,000 to $9,000 per week. But if we play a trail specialist to train them and work alongside them, providing direct leadership, providing motivation, making those on the ground calls when we do hit that slope in bedrock Jed mentioned, we might be paying them $2,500, $3,000 a week, but we will often more than double the actual output. So that actually generates some efficiencies there. We also, the more complex, the more labor resources we have, the more we have to manage. So that's managing the pay items to make sure we're not double paying for something that got done, but paying two different folks for it. But also tracking what money went where, particularly if we have multiple funding sources, each with their own requirements and strengths. Okay, so I want to wrap up a couple things we heard from today. Aaron, yeah, thank you. We'll look at a project in whole. How do we get from an idea to a completed construction? I think the key elements, and the four presenters were talking about this a little bit today, and just kind of, gosh, what makes a project effective? And what we found is that really it takes good work at all three stages, from scoping and planning to design and implementation. And if the ball is dropped at any of those, it really becomes the weak link in the chain, and the system doesn't function well. So making sure the plan and design achieves the goals of the project and carries forward the nuances that are identified during that. That we match the level of design for and field control and construction documentation for the labor resource that's going to build it. For example, if we have a best value situation and we know we're going to hire a really good trail contractor, we don't need to spend money putting in a pin flag every 5 feet. If we can communicate that to them, what our intent for that given trail is, and its character, its difficulty, those sorts of things, we might flag just a ribbon corridor and not spend the money on the pin flagging. If we're going to have volunteers or youth corps come in, we'll be very specific because they don't have the ability to or the experience to make those decisions on the ground. Carrying continuity through planning and design all the way through implementation. Jed mentioned that. Really making sure that the designers who's been involved in the conversation for the last 3 years to get to shovel ready is able to work with the contractor, speak the same language, and make sure that the final product on the ground carries out the intended goals, not just matches a drawing. Same thing with contracts, whether that's with an NGO or a contractor, that they're clear and enforceable, but they're appropriate for the scope and the procurement process, whether that's mandatory low bid, sole source, best value, really kind of tuning our approach to our context. Everyone on the call has mentioned it, so I won't go too far, but again, keeping that collaborative, open dialogue. These processes should not be a contentious kind of competitive relationship. And one of the things that one of my clients at Colorado State Parks said I really kind of stung him was, for a project to be successful, it needs to be both cost effective, but also profitable for the contractor so that we continue to have good contractors in our industry that can do good work. If we're constantly squeezing folks and asking them to lose their shirts, they tend to look to cut corners. If it's a profitable contract and they have a little more wiggle room, we tend to see not only a higher quality, but the project is just smoother and more fun to manage. Aaron, back at you.
All right, I'm going to stop showing my screen and we're going to open up to a few questions. I've got quite a few that came through the portal and we have a little time. So I'll ask a few and then we'll move on. All right, so the first one I'm going to direct towards Jeremy. And there was a question about what distribution mechanisms are used for trail contracts, like if a project's coming out, and then from the contractor side, what does that look like in terms of submittal and that process?
Great question. And so there's a lot of different channels to put your solicitations out. The PTBA is a great resource. They have a member-facing side of the website they can list things on, as well as a public-facing side. And then you also want to look at the requirements of your funding sources. So often state funding, whether it's through federal dollars going through an RTP program at a state level, there may be different requirements for how that solicitation is listed. If you're a state entity or federal entity, you have your other solicitation channels out there. The federal system going through, like Jed mentioned, GSA or the FedBizOps websites, and your state systems having their own procurement as well. And then I'll see if anyone else on the panel has other thoughts on this. But the other place that we've seen these work, I think the map I showed on one of my slides was from the Bailey's Trail System, which is a NGO managed project on federal lands, and they just launched a website to house all of their for the RFQ for their IDIQ. They developed a website to put all the information out in a single place for contractors to get access to, and they run their solicitations through that thus far on that project for about 3 phases. So a couple different opportunities out there for folks.
I think it also depends how targeted you want to attract. If you're looking for a project where you want a general contractor to do parking lots and kiosks and bathrooms, but then use a trail specialist as a subcontractor, some of the bid, the bid platforms work well. Smaller companies often don't subscribe to that because they're pretty expensive.
All right, so I'm going to move on to the next question, and I'm going to direct this towards Scott Linnenburger. If an entity is working with trail planners, at what point in the process should you bring in the trail contractor?
Yeah, I think it depends on how complex that project or the landscape is. If you have really complex landscapes that have encountered problems before, we'll often bring in a trail contractor to look at that ground with us, to ask some fundamental questions like, what do you think we're going to hit when you get 3 feet down below the surface here? We're generally not doing geotechnical kind of work in the trail development world, so we do have this unknown in a lot of projects. In projects that are in terrain or landscapes that aren't that challenging, the time to bring in the trail contractor is more likely in the bidding process.
Great. All right, I'll just move on. So, all right, Scott Gordon, do you think volunteer groups, so maybe not in a hybrid situation, should have a contract for their trail projects, or what should that look like?
I've seen it go both ways. If the volunteer group is led by agency staff, or that could be agency, could be a land trust here as well, then I'd say generally not as much. They will probably have a volunteer participation agreement. But if the volunteer group or NGO is really taking on a scope and responsible for that and working a little more autonomously, absolutely, I tend to treat them like a contractor. It may be a lighter contract, but very clearly spelling out what we're looking for and what the roles and responsibilities are.
Great. All right. So, Jed, how much should a trail design deviate based on the contractor's recommendation? So once construction has started, including structures.
It's a good question, and again, similar answer I think is what Scott Linnenburger gave it. It's going to depend largely on the project, the environment, and the relationship with the designer, whether they're in the field, at any given moment. I'll cite an example. We're working on a project right now that had construction documents detailed out, and everybody bid on those construction documents, and it was an apples to apples bid. And then once we got in the field, we started working with this civil engineering firm to try to take some of the design documents that they created and show that there were ways that we could install temporary and permanent erosion and sediment control measures more naturalistically without as much silt fence, for instance. And so, hey, can we try this technique here for a little while? Everybody comes out and looks at it. The designer looks at it. We let it sit for a few months, and we look at it every week. And over time, we've actually changed a considerable amount of at least the erosion control elements of that particular project. But it takes time, and it takes meeting in the field, and it takes that good rapport.
Great. All right. I guess one more question, and I'll direct this to Scott Linnenburger. Can you integrate a trail professional in conservation easement planning and attainment?
Certainly. You want to include that professional to give an idea as to what kind of trail and or trail system can be placed on that landscape. And then that information then enters into the conservation easement as an allowable use for the future use of that land. So it's really you have to do it on the upfront portion of the planning for the conservation easement, because after that document is written, hands are pretty tied.
Great, thanks. And I think I'll turn it over to Candace right now to close things up.
Awesome. Fabulous job, Erin. Really keeping track of time there. And thank you so much to all of the presenters. I wanted to just share the resources slide. Here we go. I will be sharing this with you all in my follow-up email that will include the link to the recording as well as the closed caption transcript. And It will include links to the additional webinars, although that we're working with PTBA on. Although our December webinar, we are still working on getting online. But it also includes emails for the presenters if you want to reach out to them directly. But we do have, many more questions that we'll not be able to address due to time constraints. But again, I will work with the presenter, and we will capture all of those questions for you guys and you in a Word document for you guys to answer at your convenience. But again, to the attendees, you are welcome to reach out to the presenters yourself. And so again, thank you so much to PTBA and the Federal Highway Administration for making this webinar free to everyone. And if you are enjoying these webinars, please consider donating as little as $5 by texting I'm for Trails to 44321. Your donation will go to the Trail Fund, which is a program of American Trails, and it helps enable us to build a fund dedicated to maintaining and enhancing America's trails through maintenance, research, and stewardship training projects. And we intend to open applications to apply for funding for your projects in early 2022. You can email trailfund@americantrails.org to be put on the list. You can also email myself or our Trailhead email as well. And I will select a couple people who donated immediately following the webinar to receive our Trail Boss mug as a thank you. And finally, we invite you to join us for these webinars that you can register for now that are shown on this slide. And we are taking a 2-week break on webinars, but we have a variety of webinars that you can watch the recordings of if you've missed any. So I invite you to visit our online store in the meantime. And also, don't forget to enter our 4th annual costume contest by November 1st. Take photos of yourself, your kids, or even your horses or other animals dressed up and enjoying the outdoors. Visit our website to learn more and see how to enter. So thank you again to everyone for attending. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and happy trails.